As night descends upon the domes and minarets of Istanbul, a hush falls over the city, not of silence, but of transformation. Lanterns flicker to life like stars on earth, casting amber reflections across cobbled courtyards and rippling waters. This is not the Istanbul of bustle and brass, but of silk shadows and whispered stories. The Istanbul of the Ottoman Golden Age. Here, the city takes on a different shape under the moon, less a place in a dream. This is a world of Ottoman Nights, where memory clings to every carved arch and slow-turning breeze. The city was once Byzantium, then Constantinople, but under Ottoman rule, it became something altogether more luminous, a meeting place of continents and cultures. Its soul was draped in textiles from Persia, rhythms from Arabia, and architecture from Anatolia. In the warm night air, incense curled above the roofs while fiddlers played in distant courtyards. The streets, though narrow and winding, held space for worlds within worlds, booksellers, shadow puppet stages, and tiny mosques where prayers hum quietly into the night. On such a night, you might hear the quiet creak of a small boat along the Golden Horn, or the click of an inkwell being opened in a scholar's chamber. Within the palaces, silken slippers padded softly over mosaic floors, and in neighborhood courtyards, storytellers gathered small crowds beneath cypress trees. It was not just the architecture that defined the night. It was a rhythm. The slow inhaling of breath after the day's business faded into the quiet rituals of reflection, prayer, and tale spinning. The Ottomans prized serenity, and the city itself was designed to support it. Mosques were not only places of worship, but of contemplation. Gardens were laid not just for show, but for shade and scent. The sounds of nave flutes drifted from open windows, and oil lamps cast gentle halos through carved lattice screens. Everything slowed. Even time itself seemed to breathe differently beneath Ottoman skies, stretching into elegant stillness like the sweep of a calligrapher's pen. To begin our journey through the Ottoman Nights is to enter a lullaby stitched with stars. With each step, we'll move gently through courtyards and chambers, across moonlit bridges, and beneath whispering sycamores. The city waits, not to be conquered, but to be dreamed. Let us begin not in daylight, but in lantern light, where stories unfold like carpets, and every breath is thick with memory. Before it became the heart of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul lived many lives. Founded as Byzantium, then reborn as Constantinople under the Romans, the city was always destined to be a jewel between two worlds. But it was only after 1453, when Mem the Conqueror breached its mighty walls, that its soul began to shimmer with a new kind of light. The Ottomans didn't erase the city. They reimagined it. Minarets rose beside ancient columns, and domes bloomed where basilicas once stood. The transformation was not sudden, but it was total, like night falling slowly across the sky. Mem, too, just 21 years old when he conquered Constantinople, saw the city not only as a capital, but as a canvas. He invited artisans from Persia, scholars from Egypt, and traders from Venice to shape his vision. The Hagia Sophia, once cathedral, was respectfully converted into a mosque, its mosaics preserved under layers, not destroyed. Gardens flourished in courtyards that had long stood empty. The city breathed again, but this time in Turkish, in Arabic, in a dozen tongues that met beneath crescent moons. The transformation of the city was also spiritual. The Ottomans called Istanbul the Dry-Saadet, the Gate of Felicity. It wasn't just geography, it was destiny. Sitting at the crossroads of the world, the city held within its walls 1,000 years of layered belief. Churches became mosques. Roman roads led to Sufi lodges. In the silence of the night, this spiritual fusion was most evident. The call to prayer echoed where bells once rang. And rather than clashing, the layers seemed to hum in harmony. Commerce, too, was reborn. The Grand Bazaar swelled like a living maze, its vaulted halls echoing with the gentle bartering of silk, spice, and silver. Along the docks, ships from Genoa, Cairo, and the Levant exchanged goods beneath swinging lanterns. By day, the city moved with purpose, but by night, its energy softened. Merchants lit lamps in their stalls and sipped thick coffee as they counted their ledgers. The markets no longer rang. They murmured. By the turn of the 16th century, Istanbul was no longer just a city. It was the pulse of an empire. Every stone told a story. Every shadow hid a memory. To walk its streets at night was to move through centuries, to feel the blend of past and present in every breath. The Byzantines had built it in marble and gold, but the Ottomans wrapped it in velvet and silk and made it dream. The story of the Ottoman Empire begins not in grand palaces, but in quiet tents. Far from Istanbul, on the steppes of Anatolia, a small tribe led by a man named Osman gazed toward the fading Byzantine world with patience and resolve. It was the 13th century, and empires were crumbling. Yet in the whispers of the wind and the silence of stars, Osman dreamed of something lasting. A state built not just on conquest, but on faith, culture, and order. That dream, cradled in the soft glow of campfires, would become the mighty Ottoman legacy. Osman's successors were disciplined, devout, and strategic. His son Orhan captured Bursa, establishing the first true Ottoman capital, where silk markets thrived under arched brick ceilings. The dynasty moved steadily, building mosques, madrises, schools, and baths in each newly won city. The Ottomans didn't simply conquer, they administrated, organized, and invited. Poets and scholars began to gather in court circles. The Seljuk style began to morph into something more graceful, more imperial. The foundation for empire was being carefully laid. One of the secrets to early Ottoman success was their inclusivity. Christian merchants, Jewish scholars, and Arab craftsmen were welcomed. In the cool quiet of mosques and the bustling hum of workshops, people of many faiths and tongues shared a dream of a peaceful, structured life. The Devshirme system, controversial though it was, brought Christian boys into elite Ottoman training schools, where they became administrators, soldiers, and advisors. From this blend of peoples rose an empire not afraid of difference, but shaped by it. The Ottomans believed in destiny, but also in preparation. Their rulers were trained not just in war, but in poetry, calligraphy, astronomy, and statecraft. Young princes were sent to govern distant provinces, where they learned to listen, rule, and compromise. Night after night, by the flicker of oil lamps, they copied verses of Rumi or studied the geometry of stars. These were not mere warriors. They were philosopher kings in making, guided by both sword and pen. By the time the Ottomans reached the gates of Constantinople, they had already become more than conquerors. They were builders of system, defenders of tradition, and dreamers of something luminous. Their roots were humble, but their vision, crafted over generations, was magnificent. And in every courtly step, every ink-drawn verse, every silent star watched from Anatolia, the House of Osman rose like a slow dawn, ready to light the world. In 1453, the world shifted on its axis as Constantinople, long thought invincible, finally surrendered to the Ottomans. Mehmed II, only 21 and already called a conqueror, had spent years preparing not just for a siege, but for a rebirth. His vision was not to raise the city, but to crown it. As the great cannons roared and the mighty Theodosian walls crumbled, Mehmed rode to the broken gates not with reckless joy, but with solemn awe. This was a fulfillment of a dream centuries in the making and the beginning of a city transformed. One of his first acts was to visit the Hagia Sophia. The vast, echoing church stood silent, its mosaics catching the early light. Mehmed ordered that it be preserved, converted into a mosque, but untouched in its dignity. Carpets were laid gently over marble floors, and calligraphy adorned the walls, not to erase the past, but to welcome the future. The conquering sultan knelt where emperors once stood, and in that kneeling was a quiet assertion that this city would not be desecrated. It would be reimagined. Under Mehmed's direction, Istanbul, no longer Constantinople, became a city of convergence. He invited people of many faiths to return. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims, all essential threads in the city's rebirth. Streets once hushed in the aftermath of war slowly bloomed again with the sound of traders, scholars, and children. Mehmed built schools, libraries, caravanserais, and water fountains. The city did not heal overnight, but under his watch, it was no longer a relic. It was alive. Mehmed's dream extended beyond architecture. He sought to make Istanbul a center of learning, a capital of the mind as well as the empire. Scholars from Persia and the Arab world were welcomed into his court. He translated Greek philosophical texts, studied geometry and astronomy, and funded artists whose pens shaped the Ottoman aesthetic. Night after night, the palace glowed with quiet study, oil lamps flickering over open manuscripts, and silver compasses tracing celestial arcs. Though remembered as a warrior, Mehmed the Conqueror was at heart a builder of legacies. He walked beneath the city's trees, planted libraries beside fountains, and left behind a blueprint not just for governance, but for grace. Istanbul would carry his name in silence long after his reign ended, like a prayer whispered between the stones. It was no longer the last light of Byzantium. It was now the first glow of a new empire. The sultans who followed Mehmed the Conqueror inherited more than a city. They inherited a vision. Among courtyards perfumed with rosewater and lined with tulip beds, they built a world that merged luxury with restraint, opulence with spiritual balance. These rulers were not only heads of state, but symbols of divine order, the shadow of God on earth. But beyond their thrones and turbaned portraits, they were men who read poetry by moonlight, listened to fountains for inspiration, and strolled under the stars and gardens crafted to echo paradise. Among the most cherished symbols of Ottoman refinement was the tulip, imported from Persia and cultivated in secret palace gardens. Tulips became more than flowers. They were metaphors. Their slender shape echoed the Arabic script, and their vibrant hues mirrored the empire's aesthetic harmony. During the famous tulip era of the early 18th century, Istanbul seemed to bloom not just in gardens but in spirit. Nighttime gatherings were held where nobles lit lanterns shaped like blossoms and sipped sherbet beneath illuminated trees, as poetry drifted through the warm air. Inside the palace walls, life moved at a graceful, deliberate pace. Attendants padded through polished corridors, carrying trays of rose jam and steaming coffee. Musicians plucked odes from strings in hidden alcoves. Courtyards opened onto tiled chambers where scholars debated history, while eunuchs ensured silence and serenity. The Topkapi Palace, with its hundreds of rooms and quiet pavilions, functioned like a miniature cosmos, an ordered universe where every cup, every curtain, every column had meaning. The sultans often commissioned grand projects, not for vanity, but for virtue. Mosques with sweeping domes and slender minarets, libraries that preserved ancient Greek, Persian, and Arabic texts, and public baths that became sanctuaries of both hygiene and conversation. These constructions were offered as gifts to the people, intended to reflect the harmony between ruler and ruled. At night, these places glowed with oil lamps, their shadows dancing across domes and walls inscribed with sacred verses. And yet, even in their splendor, the sultans lived with a deep awareness of impermanence. Poems were written on mirrors to remind them that all beauty fades. In the soft stillness of night, they listened not only to music or poetry, but to the quiet hum of time. The golden age of the Ottomans was not loud. It moved like incense, slowly, fragrantly, disappearing even as it touched the soul. Step beyond the grand halls of Topkapi and into the heart of the palace, and you'll find yourself in a world both whispered and misunderstood, the harem. Far from the scandalous fantasy spun by outsiders, the harem was not a den of indulgence, but a place of order, education, and quiet strength. Here, women lived behind screens not as prisoners, but as powerful figures navigating complex court dynamics. Their chambers were filled not only with silks and jewels, but with books, tutors, and the echoes of diplomacy carried through whispered conversations. Women of the harem came from many places, some born in noble houses of the empire, others taken as tribute from foreign lands, trained in arts, etiquette, and languages. The most intelligent and graceful could rise far, sometimes even to the rank of allied sultan, the queen mother, who wielded immense political influence. These women were educated, multilingual, and often acted as patrons of architecture, poetry, and philanthropy. Their power was quiet, veiled like their movements, but very real. The architecture of the harem reflected its delicate hierarchy. Chambers were arranged in graceful progression, from the dormitories of novices to the private quarters of the Valide Sultan and the Sultan's favorites. The walls were lined with his nicked tiles in sapphire and emerald patterns, their floral motifs calming the eye and soul. Fountains trickled softly in the courtyards, their sound designed to encourage reflection. At night, only the soft footfalls of slippers and the hushed voices of attendants disturbed the serenity. Love, too, had its place here, though always balanced by the demands of power. The Sultan's consorts were chosen not only for beauty, but for charm, intelligence, and political acumen. In the hush of velvet-draped salons, music and poetry flowed between hearts. Sometimes, a simple shared glance across a garden walkway would begin a relationship that would one day shape the empire. The Sultan's chambers were not places of idle passion, but of quiet connections, built slowly like fine embroidery. To walk through the harem today is to walk among ghosts of power wrapped in silk. Each tiled room, each carved door, once held laughter, longing, strategy, and sorrow. These were not passive women behind high walls. They were queens, poets, patrons, and sometimes quiet revolutionaries. The harem was not a prison. It was a world within a world, where the empire's most silent architects shaped history in whispers. As the stars settled above Istanbul, another ritual began to unfold, one that stirred the mind and soothed the soul. Ottoman Nights often ended with the hum of quill or the gentle clink of porcelain, for this was a civilization in love with ink and aroma. Calligraphy was not simply writing, it was worship. Each letter curved like the petals of a rose, drawn slowly under the warm glow of oil lamps. Poets, scholars, and scribes treated the Arabic script as divine geometry, a quiet meditation in every stroke. Beside these moments of spiritual artistry was another beloved custom: coffee. Introduced in the Yemeni highlands, coffee was embraced passionately by the Ottomans and turned into a refined experience. It was brewed in copper pots, poured into small porcelain cups, and always accompanied by conversation or silence. Coffee houses sprang up in every district, becoming havens for poets, philosophers, and storytellers. There, under hanging lamps and carved ceilings, ideas flowed like steam curling above the cups. The ritual of coffee drinking was deeply interwoven with culture. A host's hospitality was judged by the strength, aroma, and timing of the brew. Brides were expected to prepare the perfect cup as a symbol of domestic grace. And for mystics and dervishes, the act of sipping dark, bitter coffee before dawn prayers became a kind of sacred pause, awakening not just the body, but the spirit. In a world of grandeur, it was these small, repeated gestures that gave life its elegance. And then there was the crescent moon. The Ottomans revered it, not only as a celestial guide, but as a symbol of their empire. On coins, flags, and minarets, the slender silver arc reminded them of continuity and grace. Night festivals often coincided with new moons, when lanterns mimicked starlight and prayers echoed through quiet alleys. Even in their architecture, domes curved gently upward like the sky itself bowing to the moon. Under its light, the empire dreamt collectively, eyes lifted skyward. So many things: ink on parchment, steam rising from coffee, the silver curve of a moon, carried quiet meaning in Ottoman Nights. These were not accidental customs. They were carefully chosen rituals, repeated over generations, meant to harmonize the inner world with the outer one. In these gentle moments, the empire was not an empire at all. It was a reflection of the divine, written in the shape of letters, poured into porcelain, and suspended high above the city in silver silence. At the heart of Ottoman spirituality stood the mystics, the Sufis, who whispered truths beneath the roar of empires. While sultans ruled and soldiers marched, the dervishes turned. With arms outstretched and heads bowed, they performed the sema, the sacred whirling dance meant to strip away ego and reunite with the divine. This ritual wasn't theatrical, it was a journey inward. In the lantern-lit lodges of Istanbul, the sound of the nave flute guided their movement, a breathy tune that seemed to come not from wood but from longing itself. These gatherings were more than spiritual retreats. They were sanctuaries for seekers, poets, and wanderers. Within the tekke walls, one could hear verses of Rumi shared in hushed tones and see young disciples sweeping floors in silence, each act a form of prayer. The lodges were modest, carved wood, woven mats, bowls of water and dates, but they held a kind of peace deeper than palaces. At night, their doors remained open to those seeking warmth, tea, or simply a place to breathe. Music was central to the Sufi path. The nave flute, made from hollow reed, represented the soul's yearning to return to its source. The drum marked the heartbeat of the earth. And voices, rich, trembling, ethereal, sang a love that transcended all form. These melodies weren't performed. They were released like incense into air. Dervishes believed sound could bridge the material and spiritual realms, and each note carried listeners closer to beloved, even if they didn't know they were listening. Sufi orders flourished across the empire, from the Mevlevis in Konya to the Haftiz in Istanbul. Each had its own rituals and symbols, yet all shared a common thread: the pursuit of divine union through humility, love, and presence. The Ottoman sultans often supported these orders, recognizing their role in nurturing the spiritual health of the people. Even the most powerful rulers would sometimes sneak away to attend a sobit, a night of sacred conversation, hidden beneath simple cloaks. In the bustling world of empire, where politics, war, and trade move with force, the Sufis move in stillness. They reminded the people, and perhaps the empire itself, that what is essential is often invisible, And when the lanterns were blown out and silence settled in the lodges, one could still feel the echo of footsteps spinning across polished floors, like stars circling a hidden center no map could name. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith, stretching across 3 continents and embracing cultures from the Danube to the Nile. At its center stood Sultan Suleiman, remembered in the West as the Magnificent, but in his own realm, simply Kanuni, the Lawgiver. His rule was not only marked by military triumphs and architectural marvels, but by a devotion to justice and intellectual flourishing. Each night, under the domes of Topkapi, Suleiman pored over legal codes and poetry, seeking harmony between power and conscience. He ruled alongside a remarkable woman, Hurrem Sultan, once a captured concubine, who became his legal wife and closest confidant. Their love story unfolded not in fiction, but in letters exchanged across campaigns and whispered counsel behind palace curtains. Hurrem was a force in her own right, sponsoring mosques, baths, and charitable foundations. Together, they shaped a court that valued not just conquest, but legacy. Their partnership redefined the harem and brought a rare tenderness to the empire's golden age. Under Suleiman's patronage, Istanbul blossomed, streets filled with the sound of fountains and footsteps, as mosques rose like mountain peaks above a sea of rooftops. The great architect Mimar Sinan, once a humble military engineer, was given free rein to imagine sacred spaces. His most iconic creation, the Suleimani Mosque, crowned the city with balance and grace. By night, its silhouette mirrored the stars, arches and domes layered in luminous calm. It was not just a place of worship, but of awe. Suleiman's empire was one of contrast held in tension. Swords and scriptures, palaces and prayer mats, poets and generals. His court became a magnet for scholars, artisans, and philosophers. Translations of ancient texts flowed in, blending with Ottoman thought to produce something uniquely brilliant. At night, debates continued by lamp and shadow in palace chambers, where logic and faith found common ground. Even as borders expanded, Suleiman ensured that the empire's soul remained centered. Yet Suleiman, like all great rulers, was aware of time's shadow. In his later years, he turned increasingly towards solitude. Poems from his pen grew softer, filled with metaphors of falling leaves and flowing rivers. Beneath the might of empire, he remained a man, watching the Bosphorus from a marble terrace, listening to the call to prayer echo across the hills, his breath slowing to match the rhythm of a city that had become both his throne and his tomb. While emperors built cities and scribes filled scrolls, it was the people of Istanbul who truly animated the empire. From bakers who kneaded bread before the call to prayer, to boatmen who ferried souls across the Bosphorus under starlight, life pulsed gently through the city like breath. Each district had its rhythm, some bustling, others hushed. Narrow alleys wound between wooden homes with ornate eaves, where neighbors exchanged stories over steaming cups of tea. The empire's splendor rested quietly on the shoulders of its everyday hearts. Markets were a universe of scent and color. Spice merchants sat cross-legged on woven mats, surrounded by pyramids of saffron, cumin, and clove. Silks from Persia, ivory from Africa, and glass from Venice all met here, exchanged under the careful eye of the guilds. There were no loud cries or chaos, just a quiet murmur of barter, the occasional song of a street musician, and the shuffling steps of people weaving history through commerce. Nightfall brought lanterns glowing between awnings and the warm scent of roasted chestnuts. One of the city's most cherished rituals was a public bath, the hammam. More than a place of cleansing, it was a space of reflection, gossip, and community. Marble halls echoed with water and whispers. Elder women shared advice between steam clouds, while younger girls giggled behind curtains. In the men's section, merchants relaxed from the weight of the day, their laughter blending with the sound of water cascading over domes. The hammam was where the dust of the world was gently washed away. Istanbul's mosques were not just for prayer. They were hearts of neighborhoods. Each had its fountain, its shade-giving trees, and its stories. Children played beneath minarets. Elderly men recited quietly in courtyards, and pigeons fluttered like wind-borne prayers. On Friday nights, oil lamps were lit one by one, reflecting off polished stones and intricate tiles. The act of worship was shared across generations, not with urgency, but with serenity. It was a rhythm that matched the Bosphorus tide, steady and eternal. Through all seasons, the people of the empire carried on. In winter, snow dusted the rooftops like powdered sugar, and in summer, The scent of jasmine drifted from open windows. Those sultans and viziers came and went. The lullabies sung in cradles and the prayers whispered before sleep remained unchanged. This was the quiet glory of Ottoman life, not its conquest, but its constancy. A city kept warm not only by its fires, but by the hearts that never stopped beating beneath its stones. As day broke over the Bosphorus, fishermen unfurled their nets like prayers across the shimmering water. These men, often forgotten in the grandeur of imperial tales, lived lives marked by rhythm and patience. With weathered hands and steady eyes, they rose with the tide and returned with stories whispered by the sea. Their boats, humble and creaking, were painted in blues and greens that echoed the depths they harvested. To fish was not merely labor. It was communion with the unseen, a quiet trust in the generosity of the deep. On the opposite shore, artisans opened the shutters of their tiny shops tucked beneath domes and towers. The city's soul lived in these quiet creators. Calligraphers bending over parchment, cobblers hand-stitching leather, and potters turning clay into swirling blue as Nick. Each item was made with intention, often signed not with names, but blessings. In their workshops, the hum of the empire softened into focused breaths, tools moving in rhythm with heartbeats. These were the unseen architect's beauty. Children played in the narrow streets, their laughter skipping like stones across cobbled paths. They chased hoops, whispered secrets, and listened to tales spun by elders seated beneath fig trees. These stories, of jinn and lost empires, of lions and sultans, were passed down with soft voices and knowing eyes. In Ottoman life, storytelling was not entertainment. It was education, healing, and inheritance. Under each tile and behind every wall was a memory waiting to be spoken into twilight. As evening approached, families gathered on rooftops to share meals beneath the open sky. Dishes steamed with saffron and lentils, olives glistened in golden bowls, and flatbread was torn with hands, not knives. Laughter mingled with the scent of mint and roasted lamb, while the city's minarets cast long shadows over the domes. It was in these simple moments, passing a cup of tea, lighting a lantern, humming a lullaby, that the greatness of the empire was most deeply felt. And finally, the call to prayer rose again, soft, familiar, and full of meaning. From every mosque, it drifted like mist to the hills and over the sea, returning people to stillness. Fishermen paused on their boats, artisans rested their tools, and mothers hushed their children. This was the rhythm of Istanbul, not commanded by clocks, but by spirit. In that shared silence, the city didn't just live, it listened. Beneath the grandeur of Istanbul's surface, an invisible network pulsed with quiet importance. Its water. Long before modern pipes, the Ottomans inherited and refined a system of aqueducts and underground cisterns that whispered of both Roman ingenuity and Ottoman devotion to purity. The most famous of these, the Basilica Cistern, stretched like an underground cathedral. Lit by torchlight and supported by marble columns, it held not only water, but echoes of centuries. A place of deep calm, where time trickled drop by drop. Water was sacred in Ottoman culture. Ablution fountains stood in mosque courtyards like polished pearls, their flowing water offering spiritual renewal before each prayer. Public fountains, often sponsored by the wealthy, lined streets and squares, adorned with poetic inscriptions and floral tilework. It was said that a city's greatness was not measured by its palaces, but by the generosity of its fountains. To give water freely was one of the highest acts of devotion, a gift to strangers and saints alike. In the palace gardens of Topkapi, water became a form of art. Pools were designed not for swimming, but for reflection, mirroring tulip beds and pavilions painted in delicate pastels. Fountains whispered from marble mouths shaped like lions or roses, and koi stirred the stillness like brushstrokes on silk. Courtiers strolled slowly, their robes swaying beside the water's edge. In these gardens, politics softened into poetry. Here, sultans composed verses, and lovers passed notes folded like petals. Beyond the city's heart, in distant hills and forests, waterworks continued their quiet labor. Aqueducts stretched across valleys like skeletal bridges, their arches weathered but noble. Spring houses, built with domes and lattice vents, captured mountain water and delivered it to Istanbul through underground veins. Engineers and workers, unsung and tireless, maintained this lifeline through war, rain, and drought. For them, service was sacred, their reward found in the quiet satisfaction of a full basin. Water connected everything, body, soul, and empire. It cooled the hands of the weary, cleansed the hearts of the faithful, and nourished the roots of tulips and empires alike. In a city of fire and stone, water was a secret softness, the whispered lullaby beneath the call to prayer. The Ottomans, in their wisdom, did not try to conquer it. They honored it, and in honoring it, they revealed something eternal, still rippling beneath the surface of their vanished world. As the empire expanded, so too did its libraries, echoing the Ottoman reverence for knowledge as a divine gift. In quiet corners of mosques, palaces, and madrasas, scriptoria buzzed with quiet intensity. Scribes copied Qurans, histories, and scientific treatises by hand, each page illuminated with gold leaf and intricate arabesques. To write, for them, was not merely to record, but to worship. The smell of ink and leather-bound volumes filled the air, where wisdom from east and west met in elegant silence. One of the greatest centers of learning was the Suleimani complex, built under the guidance of Mimar Sinan. Within its towering walls stood not just a mosque, but university, hospital, kitchen, and vast library. Scholars came from as far as Persia, North Africa, and the Balkans to study logic, astronomy, medicine, and theology. Lanterns flickered late into the night as debates unfolded, not with anger, but with grace. It was said that truth, in such halls, whispered rather than shouted. Women, too, found paths to knowledge, though their spaces were often private. Ottoman women of the elite, such as Kozum Sultan or Maraima, daughter of Suleiman, sponsored schools, commissioned libraries, and studied languages and theology. In the harem, learning was woven into daily life. Tutors recited Persian poetry, girls practiced calligraphy, and the arts of diplomacy and finance were quietly mastered behind silken screens. Learning, like the empire itself, wore many veils, but it always moved forward. Books were also vessels of memory. The Ottomans recorded not only laws and discoveries, but dreams, travelogues, love poems, moral tales, and epic histories. Court historians chronicled battles with measured pride, while poets wrote verses in praise of the moon, tulips, or a single sigh. Miniaturists illustrated manuscripts with delicate care, capturing scenes of sultans' gardens or marketplaces. These works weren't meant to shout across centuries. They were meant to whisper to those who would listen slowly. And so, night after night, the libraries of Istanbul breathed quietly, their doors creaking open for those who sought something deeper than gold or glory. For the Ottomans, knowledge was not a possession. It was a bridge to the eternal. And even now, beneath dust and stone, their words remain, inked into parchment, carved into hearts, waiting for the soft hush of a reader's breath to bring them back to life. In the shadowed lanes of Istanbul, where lanterns flickered against stone walls, another kind of storyteller thrived, the shadow puppeteer. Known as Karagazvi Hasavat, these two puppet characters brought humor, satire, and wisdom to the Ottoman public. Their stories, projected behind a thin screen with figures made of camel leather, were full of mischief and meaning. As laughter echoed from courtyards and coffee houses, it carried with it subtle reflections on power, culture, and the absurdities of daily life. Coffee houses themselves were cradles of Ottoman social life. Smoky, warm, and humming with conversation, they offered more than drink. They were democratic theaters. Men from all walks of life gathered around low tables, sipping thick, sweet coffee from small porcelain cups. Musicians played the oud in corners, while storytellers recited epics and philosophers debated beneath curling smoke. Here, the empire relaxed its posture, and hearts met as equals, if only for the length of a cup. Wandering minstrels, called asakler, roamed from village to palace. With their strings as instruments slung across their backs, they sang tales of lost love, heroism, and divine longing. Their verses could soften a sultan or stir a crowd. At night, when the streets quieted and the stars appeared, these poets found audiences beneath archways and olive trees. Children gathered around them, wide-eyed, as melodies carried dreams into the dusk. In a world before recording, their songs were as fleeting as they were eternal. Festivals brought even more joy to the streets. During Ramadan nights or royal weddings, the city transformed. Paper lanterns strung between minarets twinkled like constellations. Acrobats tumbled. Sweets were handed out by the tray, and fireworks sparks joined the stars above. But even in celebration, there was grace. Children held their parents' hands with reverence, and elders watched from balconies, smiling. It was a joy deeply rooted, not loud or rushed, but rhythmic and ancestral. Art in the Ottoman world was not confined to palaces. It danced through the streets, whispered in stories, and echoed in songs. It reminded the people that even under empire's weight, beauty was not a luxury. It was a necessity. It softened walls and mended souls. And so, beneath the silks and swords, Istanbul lived and breathed through the voices of its artists, passing their melodies and tales from one warm night to the next. Among the marvels of the Ottoman Empire stood its architecture, an art form where prayer, geometry, and light met. Mimar Sinan, the empire's master architect, left behind a legacy that shaped not only skylines, but the spiritual landscape of his time. His structures balanced vast domes on delicate arches, as if defying gravity with serenity. Each mosque, bridge, and bathhouse he built was designed with harmony in mind, where the human soul could feel small yet uplifted, grounded yet transcendent. The Selimite Mosque in Edirne, considered Sinan's crowning achievement, was more than a place of worship. It was a statement of celestial precision. Its dome rivaled that of Hagia Sophia in both scale and elegance. Inside, every curve and line drew the eye upward, inviting contemplation. Windows filtered daylight like lace, and the acoustics carried the quietest whisper to every corner. It was said that stepping inside felt like walking into a prayer made of stone. Yet Ottoman architecture was not only about grandeur, it was also about gentleness. Neighborhood mosques nestled between homes, their courtyards shaded by fig trees. Schools, fountains, and soup kitchens were built with the same care as palaces. Even caravanserais, lodging places for travelers, offered quiet courtyards and calm corners to rest the soul. In every stone laid, there was intention. In every arch, mercy. The city was not just functional. It was compassionate by design. Domes became the symbol of this Ottoman worldview, neither oppressive nor boastful, but expansive. They invited the heavens in while sheltering those beneath. Minarets, tall and slender, reached skyward like prayers in stone. From any hill in the city, one could see their silhouettes rising above tiled roofs and gardens. At sunset, their shadows stretched long and soft, touching riverbanks and rooftops alike. These forms were not just beautiful. They were living reminders of balance and grace. And when night arrived, lanterns were lit across courtyards and colonnades, casting golden halos on marble floors. The buildings, now quiet, seemed to breathe with their own calm. Pilgrims wandered through arches, lovers paused beneath windows, and the city fell into a hush. Ottoman architecture was more than function or form. It was memory carved into stone, poetry made habitable, and in the silence of its domes, you could almost hear the centuries exhale. At the heart of the Ottoman Empire's elegance was not just architecture or art, but its gardens, carefully tended and deeply symbolic. Ottoman gardens were oases of calm amid the rhythm of city life. Inspired by Persian paradise designs and Islamic concepts of balance, these gardens were laid out in symmetry, filled with flowing water, aromatic plants, and shaded pavilions. They were places not only to rest, but to reflect, where poets wrote verses and mystics whispered prayers to the rustle of olive trees. The Topkapi Palace, home to generations of sultans, held gardens that stretched along the Bosphorus like velvet. These gardens were as much stage as sanctuary. Sultans held council beneath cypress trees. Ambassadors were received among peacocks and tulips. Each corner offered a different scent: lavender, orange blossom, rosemary, and a different perspective of the sea or city. The garden was a mirror of the world as it should be, harmonious, scented with wisdom, and always alive. No flower symbolized Ottoman beauty like the tulip. During the tulip era in the early 18th century, this simple flower became a symbol of refinement, peace, and ephemeral joy. Nobles planted elaborate tulip gardens, hosted moonlit viewings, and even embroidered tulip patterns onto garments and tiles. But the tulip was also a reminder of life's fragility, its bloom brief, its beauty fleeting. To admire it was to accept the delicate balance between joy and surrender. Beyond the palace, even the humblest homes had a patch of earth for herbs or flowers. Walled gardens tucked behind stone houses offered refuge to weary mothers, curious children, or aging scholars. Grapevines curled around trellises, mint leaves were plucked for tea, and bees drifted lazily between fig trees. These were not grand gardens, but intimate, human ones. They reminded the empire that paradise could be planted by any hand, not only royal ones. And when twilight came, the garden softened. Fountains caught the last light, and breeze carried the mingled scent of jasmine and earth. Lovers sat quietly beneath fig trees, while dervishes meditated near murmuring streams. In the hush between call to prayer and nightfall, the gardens seemed to listen too. The Ottomans did not merely walk through these places. They believed the soul, like a rose, opened best in silence and shade, even more than its gardens or domes. What gave the Ottoman Empire its enduring soul was the quiet force of daily faith. From sunrise to moonrise, the rhythm of life was set by the 5 calls to prayer, each echoing through minarets like breath drawn in and released. Streets paused, markets stilled, and even the restless Bosphorus seemed to hush. Prayer was not isolated to mosques. It was folded into kitchens, courtyards, and fairy decks, offering sacred stillness in an ever-turning world. Mysticism, too, had its place in Ottoman life. The Mevlevite dervishes, followers of Rumi's teachings, offered their whirling dance not as spectacle, but as surrender. In candlelit lodges, they turned slowly, robes blooming around them like flower petals. Each rotation a step deeper into union with the divine. To watch them was to feel the world grow still. There was no shouting, no fire, only turning music and peace. In the heart of empire, this was a prayer without words. Pilgrimage was another deep current of faith. Caravans bound from Mecca gathered at Istanbul's city edge, their camels adorned with embroidered cloth, their travelers wrapped in humble white. Before leaving, they performed the farewell tawaf, circling the courtyard of a local mosque while families wept and sang. These were not just journeys of distance, but of purification. Each footstep on the dusty road to Hijaz was a return to origin, to humility, to God. But faith was not only practiced in grand gestures. It was in the giving of food to a stranger, the quiet recitation of the 99 names of God while walking home, or the hanging of birdhouses on mosques to shelter God's smallest creatures. The Ottomans believed compassion was a form of worship. Even cats were fed as guests of the divine. In this empire, to serve life gently was as holy as to pray aloud. As night fell, voices softened. Quranic recitations flowed from open windows like lullabies. Oil lamps flickered behind lattice screens. The air smelled of rosewater and old paper. This was the spiritual fabric of Ottoman Nights. Not loud sermons or rigid ritual, but a shared quietude. In these hours, the empire's might gave way to its soul, and the city glowed not from gold, but from remembrance, the kind that lives gently and lingers long after. Though the Ottomans ruled vast lands, their empire thrived not through conquest alone, but through a mastery of trade. Istanbul was the beating heart of this economic tapestry, a crossroads where east met west, silk met spices, and gold passed between gloved hands. The Grand Bazaar, with its vaulted ceilings and mosaic tiles, held a hum of 10,000 voices. Merchants arranged their wares, amber, ceramics, damask, and jewels, like offerings, while buyers wandered slowly, bartering not just for goods, but for stories. Trade flowed beyond the city, through caravan routes winding across Anatolia and into the deserts of Arabia, the steppes of Central Asia, and the forests of Europe. Ottoman caravans moved like rivers, slow, strong, and persistent. Camels and horses carried not only cargo, but culture. With every journey, ideas traveled too. Fabrics embroidered in Cairo ended up in Sarajevo. A coffee bean from Yemen might warm a palace in Bursa. Commerce, in this empire, was diplomacy made visible. In the ports of the empire, wooden ships with striped sails creaked at anchor. Sailors unloaded crates of cinnamon, indigo, glass, and pearls. The Ottoman Navy, grand but often understated in Western accounts, protected these arteries of trade. In the harbor of Galata, captains shouted orders over the wind, and foreign ambassadors stepped onto cobbled piers with caution and awe. Sea and land together wove a net that held empires in balance, not with swords, but with saffron and silk. The markets weren't just economic. They were alive with human color. Women in embroidered shawls examined pomegranates. Children giggled near stacks of sugared almonds. Storytellers perched beside carpet stalls, weaving tales between sales. Even beggars and wandering musicians found their place, their presence accepted as part of the natural order. There was generosity in this chaos, a soft pulse of civility beneath the bargaining. And every coin passed was more than payment. It was a thread in the empire's great fabric. And when night settled, the market slowly hushed. Stalls closed, lamps flickered low, and the scent of roasted chestnuts lingered in the still air. A few lingered, sweeping, whispering, praying. The empire's trade never truly slept, but at dusk it exhaled, wrapped in gold and quiet. In these silent lanes and stilled stalls, one could sense not just wealth, but wonder. The long, patient heartbeat of a world that knew how to pause between fortunes. Among the splendors of the Ottoman world, one of the most enduring was a hammam, the public bath. More than a place to cleanse a body, it was a sanctuary of rhythm, warmth, and renewal. Built with domes pierced by star-shaped openings, hammams were filled with soft light and echoed with whispers and the sound of flowing water. Inside, marble walls radiated heat, and bodies reclined on warm stones like ancient statues resting between lifetimes. For men and women alike, the hammam was a social haven. Friends met there to talk, sing, and share news. Brides were bathed before their weddings in perfumed steam, wrapped in silks and laughter. Elderly women recited poetry, while young girls braided hair with rose oil. The hammam was more than ritual. It was release. As skin was scrubbed and tension melted, burdens lifted from the spirit. In steam and shadow, people found a gentler way to be alive. The hammam's rituals followed ancient rhythms. Hot, warm, cold. Oils of lavender, myrrh, and mint. A rough mitt scrubbing away more than dirt. Perhaps grief, perhaps time. Every movement was deliberate, part of a choreography passed down through generations. Attendants moved like dancers, their touch firm yet respectful. And between the marble slabs and pools, there was silence, dense, sacred, and uninterrupted. The kind of silence that listens back. Afterward, bathers wrapped in soft towels were led to a cooling room. There, under painted wooden ceilings and hanging lanterns, they sipped sherbet or coffee in delicate cups. Musicians played quietly, or sometimes a storyteller would share tales of lovers lost and found, of gin and hidden treasure. The transition from heat to cool, from solitude to community, was not abrupt. It flowed like the Bosphorus, seamless and slow. And then came night. The hammam emptied, the steam thinned, and the echo of laughter faded into marble. Attendants folded linens in silence, swept rose petals from the floor, and extinguished the lamps one by one. In the hush, the bathhouse held a deep peace, as if it, too, had been cleansed. For in the Ottoman world, even stone could breathe, and even water could remember. As the Ottoman night drew to a close, its soul lingered in the quiet chambers of poetry. The court poets, known as divan servi, composed verses that glowed like candlelight, intimate, ornate, and endlessly layered. Love, longing, gardens, a moon, the beloved's eyebrow, all became metaphors of the divine. These poets, often dressed in simple robes, would sit for hours beneath fig trees or in tiled alcoves, writing in calligraphy so elegant it was itself a form of devotion. Their poetry echoed in salons and tea gardens, where men and women alike recited aloud with slow, rhythmic intonation. Listeners closed their eyes, allowing the words to move through them like silk over skin. These gatherings were not rowdy. Rather, they were meditative. A poem could unfold over a single rose, a glance, or a drop of dew. And when applause came, it was not loud but murmured, as though disturbing the still air would shatter the illusion. Calligraphy, too, was an exalted art, considered a visual echo of divine truth. In Istanbul's madrises and private studies, masters of the pen spent lifetimes perfecting the curve of an olive or the spacing of sacred names. Each stroke had breath and purpose. In the Ottoman world, beauty was never rushed. It flowed from intention, from discipline, from the belief that even the written word could carry the fragrance of paradise. And so, as night deepened, the city exhaled once more. Minarets faded into silhouette. The Bosphorus gleamed faintly like polished silver. The Sendu drifted through shuttered windows, and the moon watched silently over domes and gardens. In homes and hammams, in palaces and prayer niches, the Ottomans dreamed, not of war or conquest, but love, meaning, and eternity wrapped in metaphor. In sleep, as in life, their empire hummed with story. And now, we leave the Golden Age of Istanbul behind. Not with clamor, but with calm. Its lanterns dimmed, its courtyards fallen still. But if you close your eyes, you may still hear the faint turn of a dervish, the rustle of silk, or the final line of a forgotten poem. The Ottoman night is not truly gone. It simply waits in the quiet, ready to be remembered again.